Hello, my name is Andrew Cooper, and I am the owner of Horrific Scribblings, and that makes me the publisher of Horrific Scribes, the web archive of provocative, scary, and strange short fiction and some poetry. We publish the transgressive and the dark, and this month, which is March 2026, we are celebrating Women in Horror Month. And one of the reasons we have to celebrate Women in Horror Month is because there is a need for Women in Horror Month, which to me is kind of sad because women are in many ways synonymous with horror fiction and the history of horror. And people have forgotten that because for the last 140 years or so, horror has turned into a kind of boys' club. So you may have heard that horror, modern horror fiction, has its modern ancestor in Gothic fiction, which was born in the 18th century. It started with a novel by a white British man. He wasn't straight though. Horace Walpole, and in 1764 he published a fairly short novel called The Castle of Otranto. And when its second edition came out, he slapped on the subtitle A Gothic Story. And it was a story about a castle with a big ghost problem, and thus the Gothic novel was born. But nothing happened. A lot of people made fun of it, um, and said stuff like that shouldn't be written in an enlightened age. And really, nothing happened with the Gothic novel as such until someone else came along more than 10 years later in 1777, a woman named Clara Reeve, and published a novel. The first edition was called The Champion of Virtue, which is really lame. Second edition was called The Old English Baron, and that's what people remember, and put the same subtitle, a Gothic story, on it, and toned down the wacky stuff with all the violence and ghosts and incest that Horace Walpole had put into his silly book. And she was a huge success. People thought this is the way this type of novel ought to be. I got to tell you, it's really boring, but boring was far more socially acceptable, and the floodgates opened over the course of the 1780s. After Clara Reeve, a woman's novel, was published, it grew and grew in popularity. We had a landmark with Sophia Lee's *The Recess* a few years after *The Old English Baron* was published, and more people were writing, and more people, especially women, were reading, and it took off until finally in the late 1780s, early 1790s, the Shakespeare of this type of fiction arrived on the scene. Another woman named Anne Radcliffe. And she became so popular that one of her novels sold for more than all of Jane Austen's novels combined. So she was big business. Anne Radcliffe was extremely important, and she set the tone for what would follow for really hundreds of years. Around the same time that Anne Radcliffe was getting going, some would say that the birth of modern feminism took place. A woman named Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote a novel that she sadly never completed, called Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, as a companion to her more famous nonfiction, The Rights of Woman, and basically used Gothic and the language of Gothic, the conventions of Gothic fiction that had grown in her time, to express the plight of women, and why women needed to have rights, and why feminism needed to come into existence, more or less, at the beginning of the Age of Reason. And as you may have guessed, Mary Wollstonecraft had a famous daughter named Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who went on to write and publish in 1818 what is probably the most important Gothic slash horror novel ever written, Frankenstein. And that went on to influence, of course, pretty much everything that has happened in horror and science fiction ever since. And some people say that after Frankenstein, the Gothic kind of fell off and went into the 19th century. The 19th century novel came into being and realism took over. That's complete bullshit. Gothic never went away. People kept writing Gothic novels. Gothic, it was exceedingly popular. Yeah, realism. Who do you think of? Charles Dickens. Well, Charles Dickens was writing ghost stories throughout his career. He was publishing ghost stories throughout his career. And for every Charles Dickens who was getting popular writing ghost stories, say, I don't know, A Christmas Carol, there were at least two women like Elizabeth Gaskell, who was feeding the Victorian craze for ghost stories. And maybe with Elizabeth Gaskell, there was also a Charlotte Riddle or a Vernon Lee, for example, who was a popular writer of supernatural fiction. And by the way, most people think she was a lesbian. So women were fueling the popular taste, which was a big taste for Gothic fiction, for fiction of the supernatural, for fiction of terror, scary stuff. It was always very popular and always a field for women and defined by women. And speaking of Charles Dickens, who was the king of realism in the Victorian age, well, there is still another competitor for the title of maybe not king, but emperor, George Eliot. Sounds like a man's name. George Eliot was a woman, and she is known for her realism, but she didn't stay away from the Gothic either. She didn't write ghost stories quite as prolifically as Dickens did, but she did write a novella called The Lifted Veil, which nobody rings anymore, but it's a darn good supernatural story, and you should look at it if you're into 19th century fiction. So, women, again, center stage. Starts to fall off, though as the Victorian era comes to a close. Something happened on the whole stage of art, and it's not about women suddenly being banned from the sphere of art or there being more difficulty for women getting into art. That difficulty already existed. That had been there for centuries, but a new type of classism crept in as the means of production for art changed, and people started to think not that novels were bad. Novels were always kind of on the bad side of people's artistic tastes, but that popular was bad. And Gothic was always popular. Horror was popular. And so as horror was pushed into the popular, people who controlled popular art tended more to be men, people who were publishing the pulp magazines, the things that were circulated as popular, as trash, as throwaway types of things, tended to be men. And they started working in groups, the circle producing weird fiction in the 80s and 90s that included people like Arthur Machen and ultimately Bram Stoker and people like that tended to be groups of men publishing for each other to read, and women were pushed further and further into the margins and excluded from that. And so we had circles, ultimately like the Lovecraft circle in the 1920s and 30s, and women were pushed out into the margins further and further, and horror became, like I said at the beginning of this video, a boys' club. So now we take Women in Horror Month to say women are still out there. Women are still doing terrifying things. Women are still doing horrifying things. We need to end the boys' club. We need to remember history. We need to move forward into the future, making women's voices as important as they always were, at least as important as men's, and make our imaginations as wide as they can be.